Thank you very much for having us here. Thank you very much, Geestdrift, Miranda, for the invitation here. My name is Peter van Dijk. I'm the publisher of Mijn Heldere Afgrond, the Dutch translation of My Bright Abyss. Sometimes, I think once in the 10 years, you read a manuscript and you don't even doubt about translating the book. First time I had a feeling with Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. That was a no-brainer. And when I read the book My Bright Abyss, I thought, I don't understand it completely. I think I only understood 30%, so I needed a translation. So we called Willem-Jan Otten, and he was delighted to translate the book. And now I think I understand 60% of the book. The funny thing is, we thought that would be a very small audience for this book. But to our surprise, it had a very big audience and some raging 5-star reviews in several newspapers. So the next surprise was Geestdrift Festival, who asked us, can he come to Holland? And the biggest surprise was that Christian Wiman said, yes, of course. So here we are at the second of 4 lectures of Christian Wiman in Holland. The first one was yesterday, and it was amazing to find all those people who find such much comfort, of so much joy in reading Mijn Heldere Afgrond, My Bright Abyss. So Christian Wiman, he teaches poetry at the Yale University, has been chief editor of the magazine Poetry in America. So yes, he knows a lot about poetry, he knows a lot about words, and I think he knows a lot about finding God in the words, between the words. So here he is, Christian Wiman. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much for having me. I think you have some copies of poems there. Okay, I'm going to give you a lecture. I'm not sure this is a lecture kind of context, but that's all right. I'm going to begin with a poem that you don't have, okay? So you can just listen. I know people's English, it seems to me most of you have perfect English, but poetry can pose particular problems. If you get lost in the poem, it's okay. Just, you can pick back up somewhere. It's mostly a piece of music, this poem. It's about being overwhelmed by something that you should love or that you can come to love. And it's by the late, great American poet A.R. Ammons. It's called The City Limits. When you consider the radiance, that it does not withhold itself, but pours its abundance without selection into every nook and cranny, not overhung or hidden. When you consider that birds' bones make no awful noise against the light, but lie low in the light as in a high testimony, when you consider the radiance, that it will look into the guiltiest swervings of the weaving heart and bear itself upon them, not flinching into disguise or darkening. When you consider the abundance of such resource as illuminates the glow-blue bodies and gold-skeined wings of flies swarming the dumped guts of the natural slaughter or the coil of shit, and in no way winces from its storms of generosity, when you consider that air or shale, snow or vacuum, squid or wolf, rose or lichen, each is accepted into as much light as it will take. Then the heart moves roomier. The man stands and looks about. The leaf does not increase itself above the grass, and the dark work of the deepest cell is of a tune with May bushes and fear, lit by the breath of such, calmly turns to praise. And fear lit by the breath of such, calmly turns to praise. So I begin with that poem for several reasons. The first is I simply love it. I want you to love it. I want you to know about a great American poet named A.R. Ammons. And it's also different to hear a poem that's recited rather than read. And so I like to encourage people to memorize poems. It's a good way to get it in your head if you don't have. I make all my students at Yale memorize poems. Another reason is I'm going to talk a lot about art and faith today, and both those things are similar in that if you talk about them in an abstract way for very long, art or faith, without concrete examples, then they pretty quickly become devoid of any meaning at all. And so I wanted to foreground things with a poem. And the last reason that I begin with that poem in particular is that it feels like a religious poem. It goes really well in a church. When you consider the abundance of such resource as illuminates the glow blue bodies and gold schemed wings of flies, it feels like a biblical passage almost. The leaf does not increase itself above the grass. But in fact, A.R. Ammons had no religious faith at all, and he could be especially caustic about Christianity, which was the faith in which he was raised. He didn't really want anything to do with it. And so one of the things that I want to talk about, one of the issues I want to raise is what an art of faith might look like in the apparent absence of faith, and what an art like this that's made by a person who has no professed faith might have to say to people who do consider themselves believers of one sort or another. Ammons represents a kind of a phenomenon that's familiar probably to most of you. He's a kind of unbelieving believer. He wouldn't really believe in anything beyond the world that's around him if it weren't for these insights that he's given in his life and in his work. William Wordsworth, the great English poet, William Wordsworth called them spots of time. These moments when something breaks through reality and you have a sense of something other. And that's what causes A.R. Ammons to turn from fear to praise at the end of that poem. The great Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel once defined faith as being primarily faithfulness to the times when we had faith. So it's something in the past. You have these moments of inspiration or intensity, and you try to remain true to them. You know, we come out of those moments and we think, well, I don't really believe in anything, but Heschel says you need to be true to the person who did believe something at one time. There's a lot of theologians that talk about their practice similarly. Karl Barth is a theologian who says theology knows the light which is intrinsically perfect and reveals everything in a flash, but it only knows it in the prism of this act, the act of doing theology, which however radically it may be understood is still a human act. And then Barth goes on to very carefully draw a distinction between theology and revelation, between the kind of revelation that a theologian might get and the kind of revelation that Scripture might give. Most artists that I know would not draw that distinction. The inspiration that they're given in a work of art is revelation, and they're going to burn in hell, figuratively, if they don't trust it. There's a great quote from Franz Kafka where he's been up all night writing, and he writes a letter in the morning to his girlfriend and says that he's finally discovered what all of these blissful hours of inspiration were. And he says, it's devastating. He says, it's the reward for serving the devil, which puts a rather different spin on art and inspiration. Christianity and art. I think about these things constantly, and I do think of myself as a Christian, and I do think of myself as an artist. You might have doubts about both by the time I'm finished, but one of the great paradoxes of art for the artist is that the art in which you feel, experience most intensely can actually require a kind of severe detachment from experience. Perfection of the life or perfection of the work is how the great Irish poet W.B. Yeats put it. He was in love with this woman, Maud Gunn, and her passions were mostly political, at least they weren't turned toward Yeats. And he said at one time, if she had only loved him at this one point in his life, in his 20s, if she had only agreed to marry him, well, he might have, as he says, I might have thrown poor words away and been content to live. I might have thrown poor words away and been content to live. His point is, you got to choose life or art. That tension between life and art, or between imagination and experience, can be particularly sharp, particularly acute when thinking about religious artists. There's a couple of famous examples. Gerard Manley Hopkins, or George Herbert Hopkins, was a Catholic priest. He actually gave up poetry for a period of 7 years because he thought that poetry wasn't consistent with the seriousness of his vocation as a priest. Now, you don't have to read a lot of Hopkins before you realize that the real reason that he gave up poetry during those years was that the intensity of his aesthetic experience, of his poetic experience, competed with the intensity of his religious experience, and he felt that he had to choose. And so he chose God. My own heart let me more have pity on, he writes in a late poem when he's pretty exhausted with the struggle. Let me live to my sad self hereafter kind. My own heart let me more have pity on. That's a piercing prayer. We rarely think to pray that for ourselves, I think. Let me have more pity on my own heart. George Herbert was a contemporary of Shakespeare, maybe my favorite English poet. And he wrestled with the same thing. He was also a priest, an Anglican priest, and not until late in his life. He had wanted to be a politician or to be in the court, and he had some success, but then was thwarted, and he swerved into a career in parish ministry when he was 37. And for the last 3 years of his life, he got married. He was very happily married, and he was apparently a wonderful parish priest and was thriving in that role, but he had tuberculosis. And so all those things were going on during those 3 years when he wrote some of his most famous poems. Here's one of them. You have it there, the first one. It's called Bittersweet. I don't know, I might not have even put the title on there, but. Ah, my dear angry Lord, since thou dost love, yet strike, cast down, yet help afford, sure I will do the like. I will complain, yet praise. I will bewail, approve, and all my sour sweet days I will lament and love. W.H. Auden, a great English poet, once defined poetry as the clear expression of mixed feelings. It's a great definition, the clear expression of mixed feelings. I would argue that's exactly why poetry is so essential to any unified religious life. The clear expression of mixed feelings. I mean, what could be more necessary for the muddle of modern religious experience and life? And all my sour, sweet days I will lament and love at the same damn time. I've always responded very deeply to these two poets, as I say, but I don't experience the tension between art and God in quite the same way. There's a quote from the Scottish runner, Eric Liddell. He was a long-distance runner. His story is told in the movie called Chariots of Fire. And he's talking about why he can't give up running to go be a missionary in China. And this is the quote. He says, "I believe that God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. To give up running would be to hold him in contempt. I like that notion. God doesn't give you a gift without giving you an obligation to use it. How you use it, though, that's where things get a little complicated. And here I'll turn to a couple of my own poems to use as a lens to look at some of these issues. A long time ago, the year after the Velvet Revolution, I lived in Prague. And I was living with someone at the time, and we lived in one of those grim, gray apartment blocks that surround a lot of Eastern European cities, panilacs, they were called in Czech. And we lived on the 7th floor. We paid $30 American a month for this place. No longer possible in Prague, as you know. It was an ugly apartment, but we had this splendid view of Prague. So it was quite a wonderful romantic situation in that regard. One day when I was at the kitchen table studying Czech, my girlfriend was in the bath, and a falcon landed on the windowsill. I mean, literally as close to me as that speaker. Very, very close. And 10 years later, it takes a long time for things to get through my brain, but 10 years later, I wrote a poem about the experience. And the poem is called Poštolka, which means falcon, or kestrel, actually. And you have it there. When I was learning words, and you were in the bath, there was a flurry of small birds, and in the aftermath of all that panicked flight, as if the red dusk willed a concentration of its light, a falcon on the sill. It scanned the orchard's bowers, then pane by pane it eyed the stories facing ours, but never looked inside. I called you in to see, and when you'd steamed the room and naked next to me stood dripping as a bloom of blood formed in your cheek and slowly seemed to melt, I could almost speak the love I almost felt. Wish for something, you said. A shiver pricked my spine. The falcon turned its head and locked its eyes on mine, and for a long moment I'm still in. I wished and wished and wished the moment would not end. And just like that, it vanished. This is a love poem by a person who isn't really capable of love. It's a celebration or rapture of time by someone whose mind is essentially tuned only to elegies, only to what is past. It is also, I think, in a peculiar and very modern sense, a devotional poem, or at least an early unconscious attempt at a devotional poem, a poem to God or about God, though God is nowhere present in the poem. That may be the thing that makes it modern. I was raised in a very different atmosphere from Holland. I was raised in far west Texas in a very small town called Snyder. There are about 9,000 people. I guess that's not so small for here, but there were about 9,000 people, and everyone I knew was religious. Everyone went to church of one sort or another. I was raised in a charismatic Baptist church, and all of my family were preachers or teachers of one sort or another. I never met a single atheist, a single one, until I went off to college in Virginia. And I remember it so vividly, meeting the very first one. He could have begun swiveling his head around and growling at me in Aramaic, and I wouldn't have been more surprised than if I just met my first live atheist. My faith fell away pretty quickly under the pressure of the books that I began to read. And for a long time, decades, I lived apart from God, and not simply apart from God, but as that poem Poštolka makes pretty clear, apart from the world too. Like many modern artists, the energy in my art seemed to come from this very distance, from God or from the world. That the energy was often despair, well, that just seemed to me what modern art was. I was not an atheist. I would never have defined myself in that way. I was actually deeply interested in theology all through my 20s. I was more someone fiercely devoted to his lack of faith, or fiercely devoted to a faith that had no object, either in this world or in any other. Sumptuous destitution is how Emily Dickinson describes it. Sumptuous, something rich, luxurious; destitution, something utterly absent, nil. Without my loneliness, I would be more lonely, writes Marianne Moore, so I keep it. Without my loneliness, I would be more lonely, so I keep it. It must be familiar to some of you. It took some serious events to shatter my notions of myself and my art. I tell the story in my book, My Bright Abyss. I'm not going to tell the whole story again, but I'll tell you the short version. I spent my life trying to organize my life so that I could write poems. To some people it seems bizarre. It seemed to me perfectly natural at the time. I remember once being in London where I was living in my early 20s, and I had met this guy who worked for Citibank, and he was the vice president of Citibank for London and Switzerland. He split his time, and he offered me a job. And we were there at Hyde Park Corner, and you know, it was one of those jobs where you go into an investment bank, you work like 80 hours, 100 hours a week. These people work forever. And I told him that I didn't even think about it. I said, you know, I don't have time. I'm working on my poems. And that's just what he did. He burst out laughing there at Hyde Park Corner, just burst out laughing. And it's kind of a nice memory. I would laugh myself now. Somebody told me that. But after doing that for years and years, arranging my life so that I could write poems, I stopped being able to write poems. I've always gone through droughts where long silences, but this was a really bad one. It was 3 years long, and I simply couldn't write a word. I mean, I could still do journalism or things, but I couldn't write poetry, and that's what mattered to me, and that's how I understood the world around me. During that time, I also fell in love with the woman that I'm now married to. And I also, very shortly after that, got a terrible diagnosis. And all of those things demanded some radical changes in the way that I was living. I had named them as separate experiences, those three things, but in retrospect, looking back at it, I can see that they were one experience. And I am still convinced that that one experience was the call of God. It took a long time for me to hear it, but I am convinced that that's what it was. Here's another poem called From a Window. It was written sometime after all of these experiences that I've just told you, after that drought had ended and I began to be able to write poems again. And it was written in one mysterious burst of energy. I used to work forever on poems, but at some point that changed and they began to come much more quickly. And this one came very, very quickly. This is a person sitting inside a house looking out at a tree, and a flock of birds takes off from the tree. So he thinks for a moment that it's part of the tree, but it's not. That's the whole scene, okay? Incurable and unbelieving in any truth but the truth of grieving, I saw a tree inside a tree rise kaleidoscopically as if the leaves had livelier ghosts. I pressed my face as close to the pain as I could get to watch that fitful, fluent spirit that seemed a single being, undefined or countless beings of one mind, haul its strange cohesion beyond the limits of my vision, over the house, heavenwards. Of course I knew those leaves were birds. Of course that old tree stood exactly as it had and would, but why should it seem fuller now? And though a man's mind might endow even a tree with some excess of life to which a man seems witness, that life is not the life of men. And that is where the joy came in. Nothing in this poem was planned. I didn't begin to have the realization that an experience of reality might open up into an experience of joy or an experience of otherness, and then sit down and write a poem about that. It was just the opposite. I was in despair. I sat down to articulate that despair, or to write that despair and that anguish, and the poem exploded into joy. It was completely outside of my control. Here's another one. It's called 4D. I don't know if it has the title there, but 4D is my wife. This is a poem. A young tree had fallen and was caught by another tree, an older tree, and it had stayed alive that way. It should have fallen and completely broken off and died, but it was leaning like this, and so it was still alive. Groans going all the way up a young tree, half cracked and caught in the crook of another. Pause. All around the hill-ringed, heavened pond, leaves shush themselves like an audience. A cellular stillness, as of some huge attention bearing down. May I hold your hand? A clutch of mayflies banqueting on oblivion writhes above the water like visible light. I don't think you had a copy, did you? Oh well. I imagine we've all had moments like this. Moments when it seems like everything around us, the vacant interstellar spaces, all the random atoms that are whirling around us at all times, they seem to perceive us, to look at us, wonderfully, terribly too, right down to the last cell of our singularity, every single one of us. The way I've described it to myself is it seems like oblivion whispers in your ear. Only as if it's not oblivion. For a moment it seems like maybe it's animated. It has some energy. You could call it being, you could call it mind, you could call it God. You might not want to call it anything at all. Both those poems were real breakthroughs for me, real watersheds, radical influxes of life beyond my own, and they felt completely different from my earlier work like Pushtolka. And that's why in the months and the years that followed, I was a bit puzzled and disturbed by some of the other poems, which seemed to come from that same tangle of anguished joy, but they seem also to end in very different places. I've had Christian friends be actively disturbed by things I've written. I've had interviewers ask me if I'm an atheist Christian. It's true that some of the latter poems, some of the poems, they have the same kind of loving particularity of detail that's in Pushtolka, but they don't have any kind of invocation of a beyond or a world beyond this one or a life beyond this one. I do think there's a kind of faith in them, in these poems, in the work, but it's a starkly mortal kind of faith. I think you have a poem there, a couple of poems. The first one begins, "It is good to sit, even a rotting body." It is good to sit, even a rotting body in sunlight, uncompromised by God, or lack of God, to see the bee beyond all the plundered flowers ere stagger toward you and like a delicate helicopter hover above your knee until it finds you to be not sweet, but at least not flinching. Its hair legs on the hair of your leg, silvering a coolness through you like a soul of nerve. Or think of this one. This is called Hammer is the Prayer. It begins in the middle of a scene. There's been a storm. It's wrecked a bunch of houses. Someone is on the roof fixing the house, and there's been an argument. The poem presupposes this. I mean, you can get it from reading the poem, but I'm telling you all this to make it easier. The poem presupposes an argument that's been going on beforehand, and the argument essentially is, of what use is God in the midst of suffering? Look at this destruction. Where is your God? There is no consolation in the thought of God, he said, slamming another nail in another house, another havoc had half taken. Grace is not consciousness, nor is it beyond. To hell with remembrance, to hell with heaven. Hammer is the prayer of the poor and the dying. And as wind in some lordless random comes to rest, and all the disquieted dust within, peace came to the hinterlands of our minds, too remote to know, but peace nonetheless. Not only is there no God in these poems, but the very possibility of God is pushed roughly to the side. The strange thing is, I felt God around me when I wrote them. There's no possibility of heaven in these poems. There is open contempt for the notion. The strange thing is, during that brief marriage of word and world that poetry is, during the writing of these poems, I felt myself projected into dimensions of existence that I could never have imagined without the poems. Can there be such a thing as an anti-devotional devotional poem? Can there be a prayer to God that seems to be aimed at God like a weapon? Hopkins and Herbert both felt that God circumscribed or drew lines around their imaginations, and faith required that they draw certain lines inside their own minds which they dare not cross. I understand the dilemma, but disagree with the solution. If faith requires you to turn away or foreclose on an inspiration, it's not faith. I don't see any of these poems in opposition with each other. I'm convinced that the same God that leads me, the same impulse that leads me to sing of God in one moment, leads me to sing of godlessness in another. God would have us know that we must live as men who manage our lives without him, says Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And then he goes on, writing this from prison. An Orthodox Lutheran theologian, writing this from prison. The God who lets us live in the world without the working hypothesis of God is the God before whom we stand continually. Before God and with God, we live without God. Clearly, then, the question of which art is seeking God and seeking to be in the service of God is much more complicated than it might seem. There is something in all original art that will not be subject to God, if by that phrase we mean a kind of voluntary censorship or a refusal of the mind's spontaneous and sometimes disturbing intrusions into reality. But I think we should think of that differently. I think we come closer to the truths of the artist's relation to divinity if we think not of being made subject to God, but of being subjected to God. Our individual subjectivity lost and rediscovered within the reality of God. Human imagination is not simply our means of reaching out to God, but it's God's means of manifesting himself to us. It follows from that any notion of God that's static is not only sterile, but because it asserts a kind of singular knowledge of God, it's blasphemous. God's truth is life, says Patrick Kavanagh, the Irish poet. Even the grotesque shapes of his foulest fire. One part of that truth, for even the most devout among us, is the void of godlessness. And, this is the strangest part for me, the joy of the void. The joy of being momentarily released from the burden of seeking and making meaning. What I'm trying to say is that I think sometimes God can call a person to unbelief in order that faith can take new forms. Let me end with one poem that shows how some of these things have played out in me. It was written during one long, anguished night when my thoughts were all a case of knives. That's a great line from George Herbert. My thoughts are all a case of knives. There's a lot of background context to the poem, but I'll give it quickly. Context gets burned away from good poems. It ought to, but this context nearly burned me away. That I was sick, sick unto death, really, in the sense that Soren Kierkegaard means it in that phrase, but also literally sick unto death. It has been my own experience that the reason why there are no atheists in foxholes, you know that expression? There are no atheists in foxholes. People say, well, it's a ridiculous expression, but it's, if things are, if you're in a foxhole fighting a war, that's a foxhole, then no one's an atheist. That's what they say. Everyone turns to God in a great crisis. I'm not sure that's so true. But at any rate, a lot of people do. I don't think it's because of the roar of death and destruction that's around you, though. The weird thing is, the very eerie thing, when you're in a crisis that threatens your own life, is that everything goes icily quiet. All of the noise that's in our heads all of the time, all of that pandemonium, that blab that's just going on all the time is silenced. And you can hear what's around you for the first time ever. And what some of us hear in those moments is a still small voice. I do not feel any comfort in the notion of heaven or eternity, mostly because I can't conceive of those things. I think Christianity, as I understand it, ought to be a scouring of the self, of the individual ego. And most of the notions of eternity or heaven that I hear seem to me nothing more than a dream of the self's survival. This is what the critics of faith have said for years, that religion amounts to nothing more than a refusal to face our deaths. And they have a strong point. And yet, something in us does seem unkillable at times. We have these moments of banqueting on oblivion, as I put it in that poem. We have our intimations of immortality, as William Wordsworth puts it. It may be art, it may be love. Any time in life when we momentarily cease to be ourselves and become paradoxically more ourselves, our souls. Here's such a moment for me. It's the last poem that you have there. It's set in Chicago, where I lived for a number of years when I was editing a magazine called Poetry. The title of the poem is My Stop is Grand. Grand is the name of a train stop just outside, just in downtown Chicago. There's another train stop named Clark and Division, mentioned in the poem. And the L is what we call the elevated train. The trains in Chicago are elevated, and they go underground sometimes, but the really cool parts are elevated. And if you've been in downtown Chicago, it's a really unique city because the architecture is wonderfly modern. It was the heyday of modern architecture when that city was made, and it's better than New York, I think, and the way it's put together. And the train snakes in between all of the buildings downtown. It's very cool. This is a poem in which, all right, I'm crammed on this train, and hot and sweaty, and everybody's hating everybody else, or I'm projecting that upon them, or at any rate, and suddenly the train creates this fantail of sparks outside, a beautiful long plume, like peacock tail of sparks, and everybody turns to see it. That's the whole action of this, right? This is a poem that attempts to answer the question, what is heaven? What happens when you die? What in the world do you believe? And this is the poem I wrote in that night of anguish. My stop is grand. I have no illusion, some fusion of force and form will save me. Bewilderment of bone light ungrave me. As when the L shooting through a hell of ratty alleys where nothing thrives but soot, and the rat-like lives that have learned to eat it, screechingly peacocked a grace of sparks so far out and above the fast curve that jostled and fastened us into a single shock of, I will not call it love, but at least some brief and no doubt illusionary belief that in one surge of brain we were all seeing one thing, a lone, unearned loveliness struck from an iron pane. Already it was gone. Already it was bone, the gray sky and the encroaching skyline pecked so clean by raptor night, I shuddered at the cold gleam we hurtled toward, like some insentient herd plunging underground at Clark and Division. And yet all that day I had a kind of vision that's never gone completely away, of immense, clear-paned towers and endlessly expendable hours through which I walked teeming human streets, filled with the shine that was most intimately me and not mine. Thank you very much.